My name is Evelyn, and I'm 68 years old. I've spent most of my life teaching children how to read and write, watching their little hands tremble as they tried to shape their first letters. I used to believe that handwriting was one of the most intimate expressions of the soul, a mirror of patience, discipline, and care. Even after retiring 10 years ago, I never let go of my fountain pen or my journal. Every morning, I sit by my window with a cup of tea and let my thoughts pour out in cursive loops, each word an echo of who I've been and who I still am. I live alone in a quiet cottage at the edge of Willow Creek, surrounded by the soft hum of wind and the scent of lavender from the garden Harold planted before he passed. My husband's absence still feels fresh sometimes, especially on cold evenings when the radio hums our favorite songs. But I've learned to find peace in little rituals: baking bread, watering the garden, and writing in the same journal I've kept since 1989. Every few weeks, my granddaughter Sophie visits. She's 21, brilliant, and ambitious, everything I once prayed she would be. But lately, I've noticed something in her tone when she speaks to me, a kind of impatience, as though my ways are outdated and my opinions belong to another world. She doesn't mean to be cruel, I tell myself, but she was raised in a different time, a time of screens and speed. One Saturday afternoon, Sophie dropped by unexpectedly. She had just returned from college for spring break and wanted to help me declutter the attic. I agreed, though I knew her version of help usually involved rolling her eyes at my sentimental attachments. As we climbed the creaky stairs, dust floated in the sunlight like tiny ghosts of memory. "Wow, Grandma, this place looks like a museum," Sophie said, half teasing. I chuckled. "A museum is where we keep history safe, dear. You could learn something from it." She smirked, tossing her hair back. "Or I could just Google it." We began sorting through boxes of letters, old lesson plans, and keepsakes from my teaching days. At one point, Sophie found a stack of handwritten letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. "What's this?" she asked, curiosity piqued. "Those are letters from my students," I said, smiling softly. Every year, before graduation, I'd have them write about what they learned, not just academically, but personally. I kept every single one. Sophie untied the ribbon and began flipping through them. Her perfectly manicured nails brushed over the pages, and she let out a small laugh. "These look ancient. Did people actually write like this? I can barely read it." I frowned slightly. "It's cursive, sweetheart. Beautiful, isn't it?" She laughed again, not cruelly, but thoughtlessly. "Beautiful? Grandma, this looks like chicken scratch. No one writes like this anymore. We have fonts for that now." I felt something tighten in my chest, a slow ache that reached deeper than embarrassment. I had spent years teaching handwriting as an art, believing that every curve of a letter carried the rhythm of a person's character. To hear it dismissed so lightly, especially by someone I love, felt like a small betrayal. Still, I smiled and tried to keep my voice steady. "You'd be surprised how many of your college professors still value a handwritten note. It shows care. It shows effort." She rolled her eyes. "Care is fine, Grandma, but no one has time for that anymore. Everything's digital, even signatures. Handwriting just doesn't matter." Her words hit harder than I expected. Maybe because, deep down, I knew she wasn't entirely wrong. The world had moved on. People typed faster than they thought. Children learned to swipe before they could hold a pencil. And somewhere along the way, something human had quietly disappeared. I stayed quiet for a moment, running my thumb over the paper. "You know, when your grandfather proposed, he didn't do it with a text message," I said softly. "He wrote me a letter, 1 page. I still have it." Sophie smirked. "A letter? That's kind of cute, actually. Old-fashioned, but cute." I smiled faintly. "Old-fashioned things have a way of lasting, dear." She didn't respond. She just shrugged and went back to sorting boxes. For the rest of the afternoon, her laughter about my handwriting echoed faintly in my ears. I told myself not to take it personally. After all, she was young. But something inside me refused to settle. I kept thinking about how I'd spent my life shaping letters, how that skill had once been my pride, my purpose, my craft. When Sophie finally left that evening, the house felt heavier than usual. I sat at my kitchen table long after the sun had set, staring at a blank sheet of stationery. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up my pen. I began to write without knowing what to say, just letting the ink flow. "Dear Harold," I whispered aloud as the words formed. She laughed at my handwriting today. It felt silly, talking to him like that, but somehow comforting. I imagined his gentle chuckle, the way he used to say, "You and that pen of yours, you could write the world into beauty." The next morning, I brewed my tea and opened my journal again. But instead of peace, I felt determination. Sophie thought handwriting was useless, but maybe, just maybe, it was time she learned how wrong she was. That afternoon, I began cleaning my desk drawer, pulling out my old fountain pens, the ones Harold had gifted me on our 40th anniversary. They were still in perfect condition, the brass nibs glinting in the light. I filled one with ink, tested a few lines, and smiled at the familiar rhythm of the strokes. It felt like waking up an old part of myself that had been sleeping too long. Sophie's laughter still lingered somewhere in the back of my mind, but instead of bitterness, I felt resolve. I didn't know how or when, but I promised myself that one day, she would see the value of what she mocked, not through scolding or lectures, but through experience. After all, I'd spent decades teaching children that handwriting reveals who you are. Maybe it was time to let Sophie see who I really was, not just her grandmother, but the woman behind every elegant curve of ink. That night, I wrote for hours, pages upon pages of letters, memories, even old poems I hadn't touched in years. My hand ached, but my heart felt alive again. And as I blew gently on the fresh ink to dry, I smiled faintly to myself and whispered, "You'll understand one day, Sophie. You'll see this handwriting again, and when you do, it won't make you laugh." I couldn't stop thinking about Sophie's laughter. For days, it echoed inside my mind, a sound that seemed to mock not just my handwriting but everything I stood for. I told myself I was being silly, that I was letting a careless comment from a young woman get under my skin. But pride has a strange way of turning small wounds into deep ones. Each morning, I sat at my kitchen table, opened my journal, and tried to focus on my daily reflections. But every time my pen touched the page, I heard her words. "No one writes like this anymore, Grandma. It doesn't matter." The ink on the page blurred behind a sheen of unshed tears. It wasn't about the handwriting anymore, it was about respect, about value, about feeling like the world I once belonged to had become invisible. I looked around my quiet home, the lace curtains, the framed photographs, the stacks of books that once filled my classroom. Each one a relic of a slower, more deliberate time. I used to think I'd aged gracefully, that I'd adapted to the modern world well enough, but in that moment, I felt irrelevant, forgotten. That evening, I took out one of the letters Harold had written me during our first year of marriage. His handwriting was firm, confident, a little messy in places just like him. The sight of his words brought warmth to my chest, but it also reminded me how rare it had become to see someone's emotions captured in ink. I realized I couldn't let Sophie or anyone believe that handwriting no longer mattered. It wasn't just about ink and paper. It was about patience, about thought, about the human heart connecting through deliberate effort. The next day, Sophie came by again. Though not to apologize, she wanted to borrow my old typewriter for a photography project. "Grandma," she said, smiling, "my professor loves vintage stuff, so I thought that typewriter you keep in the study would make a great prop." "Prop?" I repeated softly, arching an eyebrow. She laughed. "Yeah, just for pictures. Don't worry, I won't actually use it." I almost smiled at the irony. A tool that had carried the weight of my thoughts turned into a background decoration. But I didn't argue. I simply said, "It's on the second shelf. Just be careful with it." As she carried it out, she stopped and glanced at the papers spread across my desk. "Are you still writing, Grandma?" she asked casually. "I am," I replied, capping my pen. "Some habits never die." She smirked, her tone still light. "Well, maybe one day you'll try using a tablet. It's faster." "Maybe one day," I said. But inside, I was already making another promise, one I hadn't yet figured out how to keep. That night, after Sophie left, I couldn't sleep. I sat by my window and thought about all the things that handwriting had given me. My career. My connection to students who once struggled and then succeeded. I remembered one student in particular, little Clara, who had the most dreadful scrawl when she first came to my class. She used to cry over her messy letters. I spent weeks sitting beside her, teaching her to breathe, to slow down, to let the pen become an extension of her thoughts. When she finally wrote her first perfect page, she'd smiled and said, "It feels like dancing." That memory made me smile, but it also sparked something. Maybe Sophie had never felt that dance, that rhythm between thought and expression. Maybe she'd never known what it felt like to create something beautiful by hand. The next morning, I went into my study and opened a long-forgotten drawer. The one filled with calligraphy pens, parchment paper, and ink bottles. My tools of the trade. They'd sat untouched for years, but they still gleamed under the morning light. I picked up my favorite pen, a deep burgundy handle with a gold nib, and dipped it into the ink. The moment the tip touched the page, I felt alive again. My hand trembled slightly from age, but the flow returned quickly, like an old melody I'd never truly forgotten. I began writing quotes, old poems, fragments of letters I once loved. Words took shape in elegant curves, each line steady and deliberate. I wrote until the sun shifted and the ink stains marked my fingertips. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about Sophie's laughter. I was thinking about legacy. When I finally stopped, I realized how peaceful I felt. My pride was still there, but it was no longer sharp. It had transformed into determination, a quiet, purposeful strength. That afternoon, I visited the town library to return a book. There, I ran into Mrs. Hathaway, an old friend and the head librarian. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Evelyn, you're just the woman I was hoping to see." "Oh?" I asked, surprised. "We're working on a community art project," she explained. "A historical preservation exhibit, letters, manuscripts, calligraphy pieces. We want to showcase the art of handwriting before it disappears entirely." I felt my pulse quicken. "That sounds beautiful," she smiled warmly. "We're looking for contributors, people with authentic handwriting samples from the last century. You always had such elegant penmanship, Evelyn. Would you consider joining?" I hesitated for a moment, feeling an unexpected rush of hope. I'd be honored. When I returned home, I spent the entire evening selecting pieces to submit old lesson samples, a letter to Harold, even a quote from one of my favorite poets. I sealed them carefully, labeled them with my name, and dropped the envelope off the next morning. As I walked back, I couldn't help but smile. Maybe this was how I'd prove, not through argument but through action, that handwriting still mattered. Later that week, I received an email from the library. The committee loved my work. They said my handwriting had a rare emotional quality that felt both personal and timeless. They wanted to use it for a few official scrolls and documents for their upcoming event. I reread that line several times, my heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. After so many years of being invisible, my penmanship, my voice was being seen again. And then, almost poetically, I received a call from Sophie the next day. "Grandma, guess what?" she said excitedly. "My team's final year project got approved. We're working with the Historical Preservation Board on a proposal about handwritten archives and digital restoration." Isn't that cool? For a second, I couldn't speak. The same board. The same project. "Yes," I said slowly. "That's wonderful, dear." She didn't know. She couldn't know. But as I hung up the phone, I stared at my ink-stained fingers and felt a slow smile creep across my face. Maybe fate was stitching something together, something poetic, something inevitable. Because if handwriting didn't matter, then why was mine about to appear on her final papers? There's something almost magical about rediscovering an old skill, like meeting a part of yourself you thought had vanished. That's how it felt when I picked up my calligraphy pen again. The first time the nib touched the page, I could almost hear the faint hum of my old classroom, the scratch of pens, the murmur of children, the smell of chalk dust. It was like stepping into a memory that had been waiting patiently for me to return. In the days following Sophie's phone call, I immersed myself in writing. Each evening after supper, I would clear my desk, light a small candle, and let the ink flow. My hand was slower than it used to be, but my heart moved faster than ever. The gentle rhythm of the pen calmed me. I wrote old poems I'd memorized decades ago, passages from my favorite novels, and even the alphabet looping each letter with care, like greeting an old friend. One night, as I traced the letter E, my own initial, I thought of all the times I'd written my name for my students. Mrs. Evelyn Carter. Back then, my signature had been a symbol of authority and trust. Parents would frame certificates I'd signed. Students would keep notes I'd written on their essays, tiny reminders of encouragement. I realized how much I'd missed that being part of something meaningful through the power of the written word. I spent an entire week practicing. I experimented with ink colors deep blue, sepia, and even gold. I wrote quotes from Emily Dickinson and Maya Angelou, mixing elegance with emotion. My handwriting, though slightly shakier, still carried its distinct character, graceful but strong. Each line reminded me that some forms of art never truly fade. They just wait for the right reason to reawaken. Then, one afternoon, I received a call from Mrs. Hathaway at the library. Her voice sounded excited. "Evelyn, dear, you won't believe this. The preservation committee reviewed your samples. They were absolutely mesmerized. One of the board members even suggested using your handwriting for the official ceremonial scrolls. For the exhibit." I blinked in disbelief. "Are you sure they want mine?" "They insisted," she laughed. "They said your writing has emotion between the lines. Isn't that lovely? You'll be compensated, of course, but more than that, your work will be part of history." I hung up the phone, my heart fluttering like a schoolgirl's. After all these years, my handwriting, the very thing Sophie mocked, was being honored by professionals. It felt poetic, almost divine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in bed with my journal open, staring at the blank page before writing. After years of silence, the pen speaks again. Over the next several days, I dedicated myself to creating the scrolls. They required absolute precision. The texts were excerpts from local historical speeches and poems written by early settlers of our town. I worked slowly, often pausing to steady my hand. My back ached, my fingers cramped, but I didn't care. I wanted it to be perfect, not for recognition, but because it mattered to me. Each stroke became a prayer of patience, each word, a reminder that beauty can exist quietly, without needing to shout for attention. While I worked, I thought often about Sophie. I wondered if she still saw handwriting as chicken scratch, or if the project she'd joined was changing her perspective. She hadn't mentioned much about it since her last call. But I knew her. When she became passionate about something, she gave it everything. A week later, Mrs. Hathaway called again. "Evelyn, dear, the committee is thrilled. They've already used your writing on a few sample documents. One of the university groups involved in the exhibit wants to feature it in their presentation too." "That's wonderful," I said, smiling. "Who are they?" She rustled some papers. "Let's see, it's a student-led project from Westbridge University. Their lead coordinator is a young woman named," she paused to confirm, "Sophie Bennett." My heart stopped for a moment. Sophie Bennett, my granddaughter. I felt the air leave my lungs. "Are you certain?" I asked softly. "Oh, yes," she replied cheerfully. She and her team are working on a presentation about modern preservation techniques. They were thrilled to get your handwriting for their visuals. I told them it was from one of our finest contributors. For a long moment, I just sat there, stunned. Sophie had unknowingly chosen my handwriting for her project. The same handwriting she'd mocked not even a month ago. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. Fate had a sense of humor and exquisite timing. I didn't tell Mrs. Hathaway who Sophie was. Instead, I thanked her politely and hung up, sitting in silence for several minutes. The irony was delicious, but what I felt wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something deeper, a quiet satisfaction, a poetic sense of justice unfolding on its own. That evening, I took out a fresh sheet of parchment and began writing again, this time with a different purpose. My pen moved with steady confidence as I practiced the same phrases I'd used for the project. The thought that Sophie would soon be presenting my handwriting to her professors and peers filled me with warmth. Not to humiliate her, but to remind her of something beautiful she'd overlooked. I imagined her reaction. Would she recognize the loops of my E's, the gentle tilt of my letters? Probably not. She'd likely praise it without realizing it was her grandmother's hand behind it. The thought made me chuckle softly. Over the next week, I worked closely with the preservation committee. They sent digital scans of my work, carefully formatted into their presentation slides. Seeing my script on screen was surreal, old meets new, ink meets light. It was proof that the world didn't have to choose between progress and tradition. They could coexist, beautifully. As I finished the final scroll, I leaned back and stared at it for a long time. My hands trembled, but not from weakness, from awe. This wasn't just a piece of art, it was a piece of me. Every curve and flourish held years of stories, lessons, and love. Later that evening, I received another email from the committee, confirming the official list of contributors. My name was listed as Evelyn C., calligraphy contributor. I smiled, anonymous enough that Sophie wouldn't suspect, but still mine. I folded my hands over the finished papers and whispered, "You'll see it, Sophie. You'll see it soon." Outside, the wind rustled through Harold's garden, carrying the faint scent of lavender through my open window. I closed my eyes and felt peace settle over me. My forgotten talent had found its purpose again, not through anger, but through grace. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. Because Sophie's project wasn't just a coincidence, it was destiny weaving ink into justice. And soon, she'd discover whose handwriting had given her success, its beautiful face. When I was a teacher, I used to tell my students that every word we write leaves a trace of who we are. Ink never forgets. I didn't realize then how true that lesson would become, not just for them, but for my own family. A week after I submitted the scrolls to the preservation committee, I received a call from Sophie. Her voice, usually confident and bright, carried an extra spark of excitement that day. "Grandma, guess what?" she said breathlessly. "Our team got shortlisted for the National Innovation Grant. It's a big deal, only 10 university groups made it." I smiled into the receiver. "That's wonderful, dear. What's the project about again?" "Oh, it's amazing," she said, words tumbling over each other. "It's called Scripted Heritage. We're blending traditional calligraphy with digital archiving. Basically, we digitize handwritten letters and turn them into modern design elements. You know, make them timeless, but techie." I couldn't help but chuckle. "So, in other words, you're giving handwriting a second life?" She paused, considering that. "Yeah, I guess you could say that." The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. My granddaughter, the same girl who once declared handwriting obsolete, was now championing a project to preserve it. But I didn't tease her. Instead, I let her excitement fill the air. She sounded proud, and that alone warmed my heart. As she continued describing the project, my mind drifted. I pictured the presentation boards, the slides, the images, and somewhere among them, my handwriting would be displayed. The very strokes she'd mocked would now help her win the biggest opportunity of her young life. When we ended the call, I sat at my writing desk, staring at the faint ink stains on my fingers. Life has a way of circling back, I thought, sometimes softly, sometimes sharply. The next few weeks were a blur of small miracles. The committee sent me progress updates from the exhibition, including photos of my calligraphy on display. My handwriting, my own personal touch, now adorned the title banners, the certificates, even the promotional posters. They'd chosen my work for its emotional authenticity, a phrase that made me both proud and wistful. I noticed one particular image in the gallery preview, a sleek poster featuring my handwriting in gold across a parchment background, beneath a digital headline that read, "Preserving Humanity Through Handwriting." It took my breath away. Sophie's team had helped design that very campaign. And there, intertwined with her digital artistry, was my penmanship. Elegant, deliberate, alive. That night, Sophie visited again, her laptop in hand. She was in full professional mode, talking fast, gesturing with excitement. "Grandma, can I show you something? We're finalizing our visuals for the NTS presentation." "Of course," I said, setting aside my teacup. She turned the screen toward me. My eyes widened. The project presentation was stunning, clean, artistic, powerful. One slide in particular made my throat tighten, a slow panning shot of a handwritten passage in looping cursive. "This," Sophie said proudly, "is the centerpiece. Isn't it beautiful? We found it through the preservation project." They said it came from a retired educator who contributed anonymously. "Her penmanship is unreal." I leaned closer. My chest tightened as I recognized my own words, my own ink. It was a passage from a letter I'd written to Harold years ago about how handwriting holds emotion the way voices hold tone. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away before Sophie noticed. "It's beautiful," I said quietly. "Truly." She grinned. "Right? Everyone on the team is obsessed with it. We've even started practicing the same style for our final scrolls." I tilted my head. "So, you're learning handwriting now?" "Well," she admitted with a laugh, "we kind of have to. Our theme is bridging generations through script. It would be hypocritical if we didn't." There was something in the way she said bridging generations that made me smile. She didn't know how literal that bridge was. She spent the next hour explaining their presentation format, her teammates' roles, and how she was leading the creative side. I listened, proud but silent. Every few minutes, my gaze drifted back to the screen, to the graceful handwriting looping across it. My handwriting. When she finally left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching her car pull away. The night air was cool, and the moonlight spilled across my desk, glinting off the nib of my pen. I couldn't resist. I sat down and wrote again. "She doesn't know it's mine," I wrote in my journal. "But maybe that's the beauty of it. Let her admire it first. Let her love it for what it is, not for who made it." The next few days passed quietly, though my heart was far from still. I busied myself with household chores, garden work, and a bit more writing for the committee. Occasionally Mrs. Hathaway would call to check on me, her cheerful voice brimming with updates about how well the exhibition preparation was going. One morning, she mentioned something that made my heart skip. "Evelyn, the student groups will be presenting their projects live during the exhibition's opening ceremony. You should come. It'll be wonderful to see how your handwriting inspired them." I hesitated. "You really think I should attend?" "Oh, absolutely," she said. "Your name will even be listed as one of the featured contributors on the program. You deserve to see your work in action." I thanked her and hung up, feeling my pulse quicken. The thought of sitting in that audience, watching Sophie present my work, filled me with both pride and a strange nervous anticipation. I didn't tell Sophie I was going. Part of me wanted to surprise her, and part of me wanted to see her genuine reaction when the truth finally came out. The day of the ceremony arrived faster than I expected. I laid out my best dress, a deep plum color Harold had always loved, and pinned a small silver brooch to my collar. As I looked in the mirror, I smiled softly at my reflection. I might have been an old woman, but that day, I felt alive. When I arrived at the event hall, the air buzzed with energy. Students scurried around with clipboards and projectors, their youthful chatter blending with the hum of excitement. The exhibition walls were lined with displays, elegant posters, digital screens, and scrolls featuring snippets of my handwriting. Seeing my work displayed so prominently brought a lump to my throat. And then, across the room, I saw her, Sophie. She stood with her team, dressed in a navy suit, her posture confident and proud. She looked radiant. My heart swelled. I found a seat near the back, blending in quietly among the guests. The ceremony began with applause and speeches from the committee members. Then came the student presentations. Sophie's group was scheduled last, the grand finale. As I watched the earlier teams present, I felt my pulse rise with anticipation. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about recognition, about letting truth reveal itself in its own graceful way. Finally, Sophie's team took the stage. She stepped forward, smiling brightly, and began her speech. Her voice was strong, clear, and passionate as she spoke about the importance of preserving the human touch in modern communication. Behind her, the massive screen displayed slides of handwritten text, my text glowing under the spotlight. I sat there, my eyes glistening. Every curve of ink, every letter she praised, was mine. And yet, she still didn't know. As the audience leaned in, captivated by her words, I couldn't help but whisper under my breath, "You're speaking through my hand, Sophie. You just don't know it yet." The morning of the presentation arrived with a pale gold light streaming through my curtains. I woke earlier than usual, my nerves humming softly beneath the surface. Today wasn't just another exhibition. Today, Sophie would stand before a crowd, proudly showing the world what she and her team had created, and hidden within her presentation was me. My handwriting. My legacy. My lesson. I took my time getting ready, smoothing out the wrinkles in my plum dress and pinning my hair in a neat bun. My hands trembled slightly, though I wasn't sure if it was age or anticipation. As I fastened my pearl earrings, I caught my reflection in the mirror and smiled. Harold used to say that when I wore that dress, I looked like a woman who knew more than she said. Maybe today, that would finally prove true. When I arrived at the exhibition hall, it was already buzzing with people. Students hurried back and forth, carrying laptops and portfolios, professors chatted near the entrance, and the faint scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. I took a deep breath and found a seat near the side of the auditorium. From my place in the shadows, I could see Sophie on stage, adjusting a projector. She looked so much like her mother when she was younger, determined, poised, a touch of impatience in every movement. My chest filled with pride and something softer, something heavier. The event began with brief introductions from the committee. I smiled when I saw Mrs. Hathaway on stage, reading the list of featured contributors. My name was there, but only as Evelyn C., just as I'd signed my documents. Anonymous enough to keep the connection hidden. When Sophie's team was called up, the audience applauded. I leaned forward in my seat, my heart thumping like a drum. Sophie stood at the podium, radiant and confident. "Good afternoon," she began. "We're honored to present our project, Scripted Heritage, Bridging Generations Through the Art of Handwriting." Her voice was clear, professional, filled with pride. As she clicked to the first slide, my breath caught. Across the massive screen appeared a slow, graceful animation of my handwriting, the same delicate curves and sweeping lines that had once been mocked. The audience murmured in appreciation. Even the judges leaned in. "This handwriting," Sophie continued, "was part of a rare collection submitted to the Historical Preservation Project. We were lucky enough to receive permission to use it for our final design. It's authentic, human, emotional, something we can't replicate with fonts or algorithms." Her words hit me like a wave. She spoke about my handwriting with such admiration, completely unaware that the woman who wrote those words was sitting just a few rows away. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I quickly dabbed them with my handkerchief. One of the judges raised his hand. "Young lady, this script is extraordinary. Do you know who the contributor is?" Sophie shook her head with a polite smile. "No, sir. The project was anonymous. But whoever she is, her work inspired our entire concept." Her words echoed in my chest. Whoever she is. For a moment, I considered standing up and saying, "She's right here." But I stayed still. The lesson wasn't finished yet. As the presentation continued, Sophie's passion grew. She spoke about how handwriting connects people across generations, how it carries emotion in a way that typing never could. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the belief. The girl who once laughed at my chicken scratch now stood on stage defending its beauty. At the end of their presentation, the audience erupted in applause. Sophie's team beamed, shaking hands with the judges and taking a few photos. I clapped quietly, feeling warmth spread through me like sunlight. Then came the unexpected twist. The head coordinator, a woman from the Preservation Project, stepped up to the microphone. "Before we conclude, I'd like to acknowledge a very special contributor. Without her work, one of today's most compelling projects wouldn't exist." Sophie looked intrigued. The coordinator smiled, scanning the crowd. Would Mrs. Evelyn Carter please join us on stage? For a moment, I froze. The name rang through the hall like a bell. Heads turned. Sophie's brow furrowed as she scanned the audience, her expression puzzled. I stood slowly, smoothing my dress with shaking hands. Every eye followed me as I made my way to the stage. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor, each step echoing like a heartbeat. Sophie's eyes widened as realization began to dawn. "Grandma?" she whispered, disbelief coloring her tone. I smiled gently as I reached her side. "Hello, dear," the coordinator continued, beaming. Mrs. Carter was one of our earliest handwriting contributors. Her work was selected unanimously for its emotional depth and precision. We are honored to have her here with us today. The audience applauded again. Cameras flashed. But all I could see was Sophie, her stunned face, her mouth slightly open, her eyes glistening with embarrassment and awe. "Grandma, you?" she stammered. "That was your handwriting?" I nodded. "Yes, Sophie. The same handwriting you said looked like chicken scratch." Her cheeks flushed a deep pink. She looked down, clearly mortified. But then something changed. Her expression softened, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't know," she whispered. "It's so beautiful, Grandma. Everyone loved it." I reached out and touched her arm gently. "You didn't need to know, sweetheart. You just needed to see it." The judges applauded again, congratulating both of us. The coordinator said a few kind words about how our unintentional collaboration between generations embodied the spirit of the exhibition. The audience loved it, the symbolism, the emotion, the perfect irony. Sophie tried to compose herself, but her hands trembled as she clutched her cue cards. I leaned closer and whispered, "It's all right. You did wonderfully." When the ceremony ended, people gathered around to shake my hand and compliment my work. Sophie stood silently beside me, smiling through watery eyes. She introduced me to her teammates, who were stunned to learn that the handwriting came from her grandmother. They were gracious, though, and one of them even joked, "Well, Sophie, now we know where your creativity comes from." Afterward, we walked together to the parking lot. The evening air was cool, filled with the scent of rain on the pavement. Sophie finally spoke, her voice small. "I can't believe it was you all along. I feel so foolish." I smiled softly. "Don't. You were just young, dear. The world moves fast for your generation, sometimes too fast to notice the beauty of what came before." She nodded, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. "You must have thought I was awful." I shook my head. "No, Sophie. I thought you needed a lesson, one that couldn't be taught with words." She let out a shaky laugh. "Well, you sure succeeded." We stood there for a moment, quiet except for the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then she turned to me, her eyes earnest. "Will you teach me? I mean, really teach me? To write like you?" I smiled, not out of triumph but love. "I'd be honored to." That night, as I drove home, I couldn't stop smiling. I hadn't planned this. Life had simply written the story for me, one elegant, looping stroke at a time. And as I placed my calligraphy pen back in its case, I whispered to the empty room, "She sees it now, Harold. She finally sees it." The applause from the ceremony still echoed faintly in my mind long after the crowd had left. As I walked out into the cool evening air, Sophie trailed beside me, quiet, thoughtful, and strangely subdued. For once, there was no trace of the bright, confident young woman who had strutted across the stage earlier that day. Instead, there was only a granddaughter trying to make sense of the lesson she'd just lived through. We didn't speak much on the way to the car. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but heavy like the quiet after a storm, when the air is still thick with the scent of rain. When we finally reached the parking lot, she turned to me, her voice soft and trembling. "Grandma, I don't know what to say." I smiled faintly. "You don't have to say anything yet, sweetheart. Let it sink in first." Her eyes shimmered with guilt. "I laughed at you. I said handwriting didn't matter. And all along, it was you. Your writing made our whole project special." I placed my hand over hers. You didn't mean harm, Sophie. You just didn't understand. Sometimes we don't appreciate things until life makes us see them differently. She nodded, swallowing hard. It's just, I feel so ashamed. Everyone admired that handwriting, and I didn't even recognize my own grandmother's hand. What does that say about me? That you're human, I said simply. We all take things for granted, especially the ones closest to us. She looked away, wiping a tear that had escaped down her cheek. For a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who would run into my arms after school, showing me her drawings and asking me to hang them on the refrigerator. Somewhere along the way, that child had grown into someone so eager to prove herself that she'd forgotten where her roots lay. As we drove home, the silence between us shifted, no longer tense, but reflective. I could tell she was lost in her thoughts, probably replaying every careless remark she'd made about my chicken scratch handwriting. When we pulled into my driveway, she didn't move to open the door right away. Instead, she turned to me and said, "Can I stay the night, Grandma? I don't feel like going home yet." I smiled warmly. "Of course you can. I'd like that." Inside, I made us tea chamomile for her, Earl Grey for me. We sat together in the living room, the glow from the fireplace flickering across her face. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "I used to think handwriting was just old-fashioned, but now I see how wrong I was. It's not just writing. It's art, it's emotion." I nodded. "It's a reflection of who we are, Sophie. Every curve, every pause, it's like a fingerprint of the soul." She looked at me, eyes wide with sincerity. "Will you teach me? Not just calligraphy, but how to write like you do with meaning." My heart swelled. "I'll teach you everything I know. But you have to promise to be patient. Good handwriting isn't about perfection. It's about presence." She smiled through her tears. "I promise." That night, after she'd gone to bed in the guest room, I sat by my window with my journal open. The pen glided smoothly across the page as I wrote. Tonight, she saw my heart written in ink. And for the first time, she saw her own reflection in it. The next morning, I woke early and found Sophie already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with one of my old notebooks open. She had a pen in hand and was tracing over my loops and strokes with intense concentration. Her brow furrowed, tongue slightly poking from the corner of her mouth, just like when she was little. "Good morning," I said gently. She looked up and smiled sheepishly. "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about yesterday. So I thought I'd start practicing." I chuckled softly. "You remind me of myself when I was a teacher, stubbornly determined." She grinned. "Guess it runs in the family." We spent that morning together, our kitchen turned into a makeshift classroom. I showed her how to hold the pen lightly, how to let her wrist move fluidly instead of forcing the strokes. At first, her lines wobbled, her letters uneven and rushed. But I could see something shift within her, a patience she hadn't shown before. "Slow down," I reminded her gently. "Writing beautifully isn't about speed. It's about intention. Every line should say something, even before the words are read." She nodded and tried again. This time, the letters were steadier, more graceful. By afternoon, she had filled an entire page with her attempts. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was progress. I watched her smile proudly at her work, and in that moment, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, as we prepared dinner together, she asked, "Grandma, do you think Grandpa would have liked my handwriting?" I laughed softly. "He would have loved it, dear. He always believed beauty came from effort, and you're putting in plenty of that." We ate together, talked about life, and for the first time in a long time, we truly connected, not through technology or formality, but through shared presence. After dinner, Sophie surprised me by pulling out a small sheet of parchment from her bag. "I wanted to try something," she said. "For you." She sat at the table, brow furrowed in concentration, and began to write slowly, deliberately. I watched quietly, my heart swelling as her hand moved across the page. When she finished, she slid the paper toward me. It read, "For Grandma, the woman who writes beauty into everything she touches. Thank you for reminding me that some things never fade." My eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Sophie," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's lovely." She smiled shyly. "It's not perfect." "No," I said softly. "It's better. It's honest." That night, as I tucked the parchment into my journal, I felt something deep inside me settle, a peace that only comes when pride gives way to love, and misunderstanding transforms into gratitude. Sophie's laughter, once sharp with mockery, had softened into something pure. She no longer looked at my handwriting as a relic, but as a legacy one she wanted to carry forward. As I blew out the candle beside my bed, I whispered into the darkness, "Pride divides, but humility writes us back together." And somewhere down the hall, I heard the soft, rhythmic scratching of Sophie's pen as she practiced one letter, one stroke, one lesson at a time. There are moments in life when silence carries more weight than words ever could. That evening, after the exhibition, the silence between Sophie and me was almost unbearable. The car hummed softly along the dimly lit road, but neither of us spoke. I could feel the tension radiating from her, not anger, not even embarrassment anymore, but something deeper, shame mixed with awe, the kind of realization that rearranges how you see someone forever. The rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers filled the car as rain began to drizzle lightly. Sophie kept her eyes on the road, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. I watched her from the passenger seat, wanting to speak, but something told me to wait. The lesson was still working its way through her heart. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice quiet but trembling. "I can't stop thinking about it." I turned my head toward her. "About what, dear?" She swallowed hard. "About that moment on stage. When they said your name. When I realized." Her voice cracked slightly. "You must have thought I was horrible for laughing at you," I sighed softly. "No, Sophie, I thought you were young. Youth is loud and certain, age is quiet and sure. You just hadn't learned the difference yet." She shook her head. "Still, I was awful. I talked down to you, made you feel old and irrelevant. And then I stood there today, taking credit for your handwriting without even knowing it. I feel so small." I smiled faintly. Sometimes, feeling small is how we remember how big others have been for us. Her eyes glistened as she nodded, her lips pressing together in silence. When we got home, she parked the car and stayed seated, staring at the steering wheel. I reached over, resting my hand gently on hers. "Come inside, sweetheart. It's cold." She followed me in, and for the first time in years, she didn't rush to her phone or laptop. She sat on the couch, staring into the fire, her posture folded inward. I could tell she was carrying the weight of what happened, not because she'd been embarrassed publicly, but because she finally understood the value of what she'd dismissed so easily. After a few moments, she whispered, "When they called your name, I couldn't look at you. I wanted to, but I couldn't. I was so ashamed." I sat beside her, my hands folded in my lap. "You didn't have to look at me, Sophie. The truth doesn't need witnesses. It just needs time to settle." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, laughing weakly through her tears. "You always say things like that, so calm, so wise. I wish I could be like that." "You will be," I said gently. "Humility teaches us what pride never can." She took a deep breath and leaned back, letting the firelight reflect in her eyes. "Do you know what the judges said after you left the stage? They said your handwriting had emotion in every stroke. One of them said it looked like love written down. I didn't understand what that meant at first, but now I do." I smiled. "Handwriting is love, in a way. It's time we give willingly. Every letter takes a moment of our lives we'll never get back. That's why it's so precious." Sophie nodded slowly, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "I didn't deserve you being kind to me after how I treated you." I reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way I used to when she was little. "Sweetheart, love isn't about deserving. It's about giving anyway." She broke, then truly broke. The tears she'd been holding back came rushing out. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed quietly, shoulders trembling. I let her cry. I didn't say anything. Didn't try to soothe her. Some lessons aren't meant to be interrupted. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were red, but her voice steadier. I want to make it up to you, Grandma. I don't just want to learn calligraphy, I want to honor it. I want to keep it alive. I smiled softly. That's a beautiful goal. I mean it, she said, leaning forward. People my age don't understand what it means to create something slowly. Everything's instant text messages, emojis, emails. No one pauses long enough to put their heart on paper anymore, but I want to change that. Hearing her speak, with such conviction, made my chest tighten with pride. She wasn't just apologizing, she was transforming. The same passion that once dismissed tradition was now burning for it. She stood abruptly and walked over to my writing desk. I watched as she opened the drawer and pulled out my old calligraphy pen, the burgundy one Harold had given me decades ago. She turned it over in her hands, the gold nib catching the light. Can I? She asked quietly. I nodded. It's yours now. Her eyes widened. Really? Yes. It's been waiting for someone who understands what it means. She held the pen reverently, as though afraid to breathe too hard. Then she sat at the desk, dipped the nib into the ink, and began to write. I stood behind her, watching as she formed the first letter in E. It wobbled slightly, but the care in her hand was unmistakable. Her next word was, "Thank you." She looked up at me, eyes shimmering, and smiled. Something about that moment etched itself into my memory. The sight of my granddaughter, head bowed in humility, holding the same pen I once used to sign student diplomas, love letters, and lesson plans. It was as if life had come full circle. I placed a hand on her shoulder. You've already made it up to me, Sophie. You've learned the lesson ink was always meant to teach, that permanence isn't in the paper, it's in the effort. She smiled, blinking away another tear. You always make everything sound like poetry. Writing is poetry, I said softly. Even when it's just 2 words that come from the heart. Later that night, after she went to bed, I lingered at the desk, rereading the words she'd written. They were shaky, uneven, but beautiful in their sincerity. I placed the sheet gently inside my journal, right beside the letter Harold had written me all those years ago. As I closed the book, I felt something loosen inside me, the ache of being underestimated, the sting of being mocked. It was gone, replaced by something gentler. Sophie's humility had washed it all away. That night, before I turned out the light, I stood by her door. She was fast asleep, the pen still resting on the nightstand beside her. I smiled, whispering softly, "Sleep well, my love. Tomorrow, we'll write something new together." And for the first time in years, I slept soundly, knowing that what had once been a wound had healed not with words of apology, but with ink, patience, and the quiet grace of humility. The house felt strangely quiet after everything that had happened. The applause from the ceremony, the soft click of cameras, the murmurs of admiration, they had all faded into memory. What remained now was silence, that deep, introspective kind that fills a home after a storm has passed. Sophie had gone back to her apartment for a few days to prepare for her finals, promising to visit again soon. The stillness she left behind seemed to stretch across every room. Her laughter had once bounced off these walls, even when it carried teasing or impatience. Now, I almost missed it. I sat at my writing desk, the afternoon sunlight pouring through the lace curtains, illuminating the burgundy pen Sophie had been using. It rested gently atop a blank sheet of paper, as if waiting. I smiled to myself, she had left it there on purpose. I could feel it in my bones. For years, my desk had been my refuge, a place where I poured out everything I couldn't say aloud. But lately, it had become something else, a bridge between generations. The thought made me reach for my journal. I opened it to a fresh page and began to write. The world applauds the loud, but it's the quiet moments afterward that shape who we become. As the ink flowed, I thought of Sophie standing on that stage. The way her voice had quivered when she realized the handwriting she adored was mine. the way her eyes softened when humility finally met pride. That image replayed again and again, but not with smug satisfaction. No, what I felt was gratitude. Life had given me the rare gift of seeing understanding bloom in someone I loved. Not through confrontation, but through truth revealed in its own time. A few days later, Sophie called. Her voice sounded lighter, calmer. "Grandma, I can't stop thinking about everything that happened," she said. "The ceremony, your handwriting, all of it. I've been talking to my team about creating a continuation of our project, something permanent." "Oh?" I asked, intrigued. "Yes," she continued, her words tumbling quickly with excitement. "We want to start a foundation that preserves handwritten stories from people across the country, letters, journals, recipes, anything. We're calling it the Legacy Lines Project." I smiled so hard my cheeks ached. "That's a beautiful idea, Sophie." She laughed softly. "You inspired it. Actually, you started it. We just gave it a name." For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I just listened to her voice. So full of purpose. She was no longer the girl who rolled her eyes at my letters. She was a woman carrying forward something much bigger than herself, and she didn't even realize how proud Harold and I would have been. That evening, I wrote her a letter, not a text, not an email, but a proper letter sealed in an envelope. I told her how proud I was, how seeing her transformation had been one of the greatest joys of my life. At the end, I added one simple line: "The silence after applause is where character is born." I mailed it the next morning. A week passed before Sophie came to visit again. When she arrived, she hugged me tighter than she ever had before. There were no words, just the warmth of understanding that only family can share. "Over tea," she said. "Grandma, I read your letter." I cried. I chuckled softly. "You've been doing a lot of that lately." She laughed too, wiping at her eyes. "I know. But it's different now. It's not sadness. It's gratitude. You taught me something I can't ever unlearn." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "That's all I ever wanted, my dear. For you to see the beauty in the things the world rushes past." After tea, she asked if we could go through my old letters again, the ones she'd once called chicken scratch. I agreed, and we spent the afternoon sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by boxes of memories. Sophie picked up one envelope after another, her fingers tracing the ink, the edges worn soft with time. "These are incredible," she murmured. "Each one feels like a piece of history." "They are," I said. "Each one was written by someone with a story. Someone who took the time to say something that mattered." She looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you ever regret not writing more?" I shook my head. "No. I wrote what needed to be written, when it needed to be said. The rest was meant to be lived." Her gaze softened. "I think I understand that now." Later that evening, as the sky turned dusky pink, Sophie pulled out a notebook of her own. "I started journaling," she confessed with a sheepish smile. "Every night before bed, just little things, what I felt, what I noticed, what I learned." I raised an eyebrow, teasing. "And how's your handwriting coming along?" She grinned. "Better, not perfect, but better." "I even got a compliment from my professor," she said. "My notes look elegant." I laughed, truly laughed. "Elegant? That's quite the upgrade from chicken scratch." She giggled too, her laughter mingling with mine, warm, light, real. It filled the quiet house like music. When the laughter faded, she turned serious again. "Grandma, I want to ask you something." "Of course. If I create this foundation, the Legacy Lines Project, will you be part of it? Like, officially? As a mentor or advisor or something? I can't do it without you." My chest tightened. "Oh, Sophie," I smiled softly. "You don't need me to lead it. But I'll stand beside you every step of the way." She beamed. "That's all I need." Before she left that night, she handed me a small envelope. "Don't open this until tomorrow morning," she said with a mysterious grin. The next day, after breakfast, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in Sophie's now elegant cursive. Dear Grandma, yesterday, as we sat among your letters, I realized something. You didn't just teach me handwriting, you taught me patience, intention, and how to see love in small things. The world moves too fast, but your pen taught me to slow down. I'll spend the rest of my life helping others do the same. Love always, Sophie. I read it twice, then a third time, tears spilling freely down my cheeks. It was perfect not because of its symmetry or its grace, but because it came from the heart. I placed her letter on my desk beside Harold's old one. The 2 pages, one yellowed with age, the other crisp and new, looked like generations talking to each other. Ink connecting time. That afternoon, I stepped outside into the garden. The lavender was in bloom, filling the air with that soft, familiar scent. The breeze rustled through the petals like whispered words. I thought of Harold, of Sophie, of all the students I'd ever taught. The applause from the world had faded long ago, but what remained was this, the quiet, steady rhythm of legacy. I smiled to myself and whispered into the wind. The noise passes, but love written in ink never fades. And in the silence that followed, I felt peace, deep, unshakable peace. There's a certain magic in watching someone you love rediscover wonder. Every teacher knows the look that flicker in the eyes when a lesson finally takes root, when confusion turns into curiosity. Seeing that same look on Sophie's face as she began to fall in love with handwriting made me feel young again. It reminded me of my years in the classroom, the ink-stained fingers, the soft hum of concentration as my students bent over their notebooks, learning not just how to write, but how to see beauty in effort. Now, decades later, I found myself in the role of teacher once more, but this time, my student was my granddaughter. Sophie began coming over every evening after work. Sometimes she'd bring takeout for both of us, other times she'd insist on cooking, though her idea of cooking usually meant pasta and store-bought sauce. I didn't mind. What mattered was that she was here willingly, eagerly, humbly. I had rearranged the small study to make room for both of us. 2 desks sat side by the window, each with a lamp and a stack of parchment. My old calligraphy sets, once tucked away like relics, now gleamed under the light tools of history being reborn through new hands. On her first official lesson day, Sophie arrived early, her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back. "I'm ready," she said, eyes bright. I smiled, handing her a pen. "Then let's begin." At first, her strokes were hesitant. Her hand trembled slightly, the ink bleeding unevenly at the edges. She sighed in frustration. "It's harder than it looks," she muttered, pouting slightly. "It always is," I said gently. "But that's the point. Writing teaches patience before it teaches precision." She looked at me, brow furrowed. "Patience, huh? I thought this was about handwriting." I chuckled softly. "Everything worth doing is about patience, Sophie. Handwriting just happens to make it visible." She tried again. This time, she slowed her wrist, letting the motion flow rather than forcing it. The line was still imperfect, but better, smoother, more intentional. I nodded approvingly. "That's it," I said. "Don't control the pen. Guide it. Writing isn't about strength, it's about rhythm." She grinned. "Like dancing?" "Exactly," I replied. "You've always had a way with words, dear." Each night, we practiced together. Sometimes we'd fall into conversation about life, about Harold, about her dreams. Other times we'd work in silence, the only sound the soft scratching of our pens. It was a music all its own, a duet of generations. One evening, as we worked under the golden glow of the desk lamps, Sophie paused mid-sentence. "Grandma," she said quietly. "I never asked. Did you ever regret retiring when you did?" I thought for a moment before answering. "No. I think I taught as long as I was meant to. But sometimes, yes, I missed it, the joy of watching people learn, the feeling of purpose." She smiled softly. "Well, looks like you're teaching again." That simple statement warmed me more than she could ever know. As the weeks passed, Sophie's skill improved remarkably. Her letters grew more elegant, her spacing deliberate, her curves graceful. But what impressed me most wasn't her progress on paper, it was her growth in spirit. She began bringing stories to write her own reflections, little essays about slowing down and reconnecting with what she called the heartbeat of words. I could see her rediscovering something modern life had almost erased: the quiet joy of taking one's time. One rainy evening, she arrived with a notebook in her arms. "I've been thinking," she said, sitting down beside me. "What if we hosted a workshop? A community one to teach people handwriting and letter writing again? Like, reconnect them with the art of slowing down?" My eyebrows lifted. "A workshop?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Yes. You could teach, I could organize it. We could call it Letters for the Soul. What do you think?" I laughed softly. "You sound like me 40 years ago. That's not a bad thing, right?" She teased. "No," I said, smiling. "It's the best thing that's ever happened to me." We began planning that very night. We drafted lesson outlines, made flyers, even created a simple logo, her modern design paired with my hand-lettered title. It was a beautiful fusion of old and new, of ink and innovation. Within 2 weeks, the library had agreed to host us. Mrs. Hathaway, ever supportive, practically squealed over the phone when I told her, "Evelyn, this is marvelous. You and Sophie together, what a story." On the day of the first workshop, I arrived early to set up. Rows of tables were arranged neatly, each with ink bottles, pens, and parchment. Sophie handled the digital side, setting up a projector, a sign-in sheet, and a slideshow about the history of handwriting. When people began to arrive, I was stunned. There were more than 30 participants: children, teenagers, even elderly couples. Some were artists, others were simply curious. All of them came seeking connection. I began the session by introducing Sophie. She smiled shyly, then said, "A few months ago, I didn't believe handwriting mattered. But today, I'm standing here because it changed my life." The audience listened intently as she spoke about our journey, how her laughter had turned into learning, and how ink had become our bond. When she finished, I took the stage and began the first lesson. I showed them how to hold their pens, how to let their wrists move freely, how to breathe between strokes. The room filled with soft scratching, occasional giggles, and sighs of concentration. Sophie moved through the crowd, offering encouragement. She was a natural patient, kind, radiant. At the end of the class, a little girl approached me, holding up her paper proudly. "Look, Mrs. Carter, I wrote my name." Her letters were uneven, but her smile was pure joy. I knelt beside her, tears pricking my eyes. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I whispered. "You wrote your heart." Sophie caught my eye from across the room, her expression full of emotion. She mouthed the words, "Thank you." That evening, after everyone left, Sophie and I sat in the quiet library, surrounded by sheets of practice paper and half-empty ink bottles. The sun was setting through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over everything. She leaned her head against my shoulder. "I get it now," she whispered. "This isn't just handwriting, it's healing." I smiled, resting my cheek against her hair. "Yes, my love. Ink has always been medicine for the soul." As we packed up, I glanced once more at the tables, the scattered pages, the little puddles of spilled ink, the lingering scent of parchment and effort. It was messy and imperfect, but utterly beautiful. When we stepped outside, the sky had turned a dusky lavender, the same color as the flowers Harold once planted for me. I took a deep breath, feeling his presence in the wind. Sophie slipped her arm through mine. "Same time tomorrow?" I laughed softly. "You're the one teaching me patience now, aren't you?" She smiled. "Maybe we're teaching each other." And as we walked home beneath the fading light, I realized that some lessons never end, they simply find new hands to continue them. A lesson written in love, I thought, never fades with time. I never imagined that something as simple as ink and paper could ripple out into the world the way it did. What started as quiet lessons between a grandmother and her granddaughter had somehow turned into something much bigger. A movement, a calling, maybe even a legacy in the making. It began one crisp autumn morning when Sophie arrived at my door with a spark in her eyes I hadn't seen since she was a little girl. She carried her laptop under one arm and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. "Grandma," she said breathlessly, "I've been thinking. What if we took our workshop idea and made it permanent?" I looked up from the journal I'd been writing in. "Permanent? What do you mean?" She sat beside me, opening her laptop to reveal sketches and notes. "I mean, turning it into an organization, a business, really. A way to keep handwriting alive, but also give it a modern purpose. We'd call it Ink Bond. It would connect people, families, artists, even businesses through personalized handwriting preservation." I leaned closer, fascinated. "Ink Bond," I repeated softly. "That's a beautiful name," she grinned. "Right? It symbolizes what handwriting does. It bonds people, across generations, across time." As she explained her plan, I felt something warm bloom inside me. Sophie had always been ambitious, but this was different. Her voice carried not the arrogance of youth but the conviction of purpose. She wanted to create a platform where people could digitize old letters while keeping the essence of handwriting alive, transforming it into art, jewelry, framed keepsakes, and digital family trees, where every generation's handwriting would live on. "You'd be our calligraphy consultant," she said excitedly. "Your work, your guidance, everything you taught me would shape it. Grandma, we could help people feel connected again." I smiled through misty eyes. "Oh, Sophie, you've found your calling, haven't you?" She blushed slightly. "Maybe. Or maybe I just found yours and carried it forward." Within weeks, Sophie threw herself into the project. She registered the business, created a website, and began reaching out to the same preservation networks that had once featured my handwriting. I watched her work late into the night, sketching logos and crafting mission statements, the glow of her computer screen reflecting in her determined eyes. I helped where I could, designing sample calligraphy pieces, writing letters for their promotional campaigns, and editing the copy on their website. Sophie often joked that I was their chief handwriting officer. I didn't mind the title. Soon, we hosted our official launch at the same library where we'd held our first workshop. Mrs. Hathaway nearly burst with pride when she introduced us to the small crowd gathered for the event. "Today," she said, "we're witnessing something rare, a revival of a lost art, born from the bond between two generations." The applause was gentle but heartfelt. Sophie stepped up to the podium, dressed smartly in a navy dress, her hair pulled back neatly. She spoke with poise and sincerity, telling our story, not the polished marketing version, but the real one. She told them about the day she mocked my handwriting, about the lesson I never had to speak aloud, and about how humility and love had reshaped her view of the world. I listened from the front row, tears threatening to spill as her voice trembled slightly. "Handwriting isn't just about words," Sophie said. "It's about time. It's about presence. It's the one thing technology can't replace: the mark of a living soul. And I learned that from the woman who taught me how to write my name." When she finished, the audience stood to applaud. And though I'd never been one for the spotlight, in that moment, I felt Harold's spirit beside me, proud, beaming, and whispering in that soft, knowing way of his. "See, Evelyn? You never stopped teaching." After the launch, Ink Bond grew faster than either of us anticipated. Orders began pouring in. People wanted personalized prints of their parents' handwriting, framed wedding vows, even memorial art made from letters of loved ones who had passed. I spent my days in my study, writing sample templates, crafting messages, and teaching our small but passionate team the nuances of calligraphy. Sophie handled the logistics and marketing, but she always came to me for approval before finalizing any design. "Your handwriting built this, Grandma," she'd say, proudly. "It's only right that you have the final say." I often watched her work and marveled at how much she'd changed. Gone was the impatient, dismissive young woman who once rolled her eyes at tradition. In her place stood a leader, creative, empathetic, and humble. She had taken the very thing she once mocked and turned it into her mission. One evening, as we packaged a set of handwritten love letters for a client, Sophie said softly, "Do you realize what we're doing, Grandma? We're helping people remember what connection feels like. We're giving them something to hold, not just look at on a screen." I smiled. Yes, dear, we're bringing touch back to love. That same night, we sat outside under the stars, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of lavender from Harold's old garden. Sophie leaned her head on my shoulder and said, I think about him a lot lately, Grandpa. I think he'd be proud of you. I chuckled. Oh, he'd be proud of you. He always said you had fire in your spirit. You just needed to find the right flame. She laughed softly. I guess you handed me the match. As months went by, Ink Bond became more than a business, it became a movement. Schools began reaching out, asking for handwriting workshops. Families sent us letters thanking us for helping them reconnect. Even local news channels featured our story, calling it the Grandmother-Granddaughter Project Bridging Generations. I'll never forget the day Sophie showed me one of our first major media articles. My handwriting, the same loops and curves Sophie once mocked, was printed across the newspaper's front page under the headline, Ink That Connects. I stared at it for a long moment, then laughed through tears. Well? I said. I suppose that's one way to make a comeback. Sophie hugged me tightly. You didn't make a comeback, Grandma. You never left. The world just had to catch up. From then on, every letter I wrote, every word I shaped, carried a deeper sense of meaning. It wasn't just ink anymore, it was heritage finding its way into the future, one stroke at a time. Sometimes I'd stand in the quiet studio we'd built in the back of my house, sunlight filtering through the curtains, the faint smell of parchment and ink in the air, and I'd whisper to myself, this is what legacy feels like. Sophie once told me that handwriting was our bridge between past and present. But I think she was wrong about one thing. It wasn't a bridge, it was a lifeline. A thread of humanity woven through every generation, reminding us that love, patience, and presence never go out of style. As we closed up the studio one evening, Sophie turned off the lights and said, You know, Grandma, people always told me I'd have to build my own future. But I think I just helped finish yours. I smiled, squeezing her hand. No, my darling. We built a future together. And as we walked out into the soft glow of twilight, I realized that my handwriting, my so-called chicken scratch, had written something far greater than words. It had written redemption, it had written love, it had written forever. Some letters wait their whole lives to be read. They sit quietly, tucked away in drawers or boxes, holding breathless truths between folded creases. I didn't know it that morning, but one such letter was waiting for me, a piece of my past I hadn't realized I still needed. It was early spring when it happened. Sophie and I were reorganizing my attic, sorting through the remnants of decades' photographs, holiday cards, old lesson plans, and boxes of letters I'd kept since my teaching days. Dust motes floated through the sunlight as we worked side by side, her laughter lightening the air. Grandma, Sophie said, wiping her forehead. You could open a museum with all these papers. I smiled, gently brushing off a box labeled, Harold's, Things. Your grandfather liked to keep memories in words. He said they lasted longer that way. As I lifted the lid, the faint smell of cedar and thyme filled the room. Inside were Harold's journals, his fountain pen, and a small stack of envelopes bound by a faded ribbon. I recognized his handwriting, instantly neat but strong, the loops wide and deliberate. Sophie noticed my pause. Are those from Grandpa? I nodded, my throat tightening. Yes. I haven't opened this box in years, she smiled softly. Maybe it's time. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave the past undisturbed, to let Harold's words rest where they'd been safe all these years. But curiosity and love tugged at me. Slowly, I untied the ribbon and sifted through the letters. Most were from our early years together, tender love notes exchanged during his military service. But at the very bottom was one envelope that stood out newer. Sealed in crisp ivory paper with my name written in his familiar script. Evelyn for later. My breath caught. For later, I whispered aloud. Sophie leaned closer. You've never seen that one before? I shook my head. My hands trembled as I turned it over. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the seal was still intact. I hesitated, staring at it as though it might vanish if I blinked. Do you want me to leave you alone to read it? Sophie asked gently. I nodded. Thank you, dear. She kissed my cheek, then quietly went downstairs, leaving me alone with the echoes of yesterday. I broke the seal carefully, unfolding the letter inside. The ink had faded a little, but Harold's handwriting was as familiar as ever. I could almost hear his voice as I began to read. My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, then time has carried us to different rooms in the same house of life. I wanted to leave you something, not for comfort, but for remembrance. You were always the one who taught others how to leave a mark on paper, on hearts, on time itself. Do you remember what I used to tell you? That handwriting is the soul's way of proving it existed? If you ever feel lonely, my love, just write. Because in writing, we continue conversations that life pauses but never ends. I know you'll keep writing. I know you'll teach someone, maybe Sophie, to hold a pen with the same grace you held our life together. And when you do, think of me. I'll be there, between your words, smiling at the woman who made everything beautiful. Forever yours, Harold. By the time I reached the last line, the words blurred through my tears. I pressed the letter to my chest, my heartbeat thudding softly against the paper. For a long moment, I sat there in silence. It felt as if Harold were right beside me, his steady hand resting over mine. He had known somehow, even then, that I would keep teaching, keep passing on the art we both loved. When I finally descended the attic stairs, Sophie looked up from the kitchen table where she'd been organizing folders. Her face fell when she saw my expression. "Grandma, are you okay?" I nodded, smiling through my tears. "Better than okay, sweetheart," he wrote to me for later. And I guess now is later. She walked over and hugged me, wrapping her arms tight around my shoulders. "Can I read it?" she asked softly. I hesitated for a moment, then handed her the letter. As she read, her eyes welled up too. When she finished, she pressed her palm gently against the paper. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew we'd be doing this together." I nodded. He always believed handwriting wasn't just communication, it was connection, even beyond time. Sophie smiled through her tears. "We should share it, maybe include it in our next workshop, show people how writing can live forever." The idea warmed my heart. "That's a beautiful thought. Yes, let's do that." The following week, we planned a special event at the library, Letters Across Time. People were invited to bring letters from loved ones, read them aloud, and share their stories. Sophie designed the posters, I wrote the invitations by hand. When the evening came, the room was filled with people clutching envelopes yellowed with age, some frayed at the corners, some still sealed after decades. There was laughter, there were tears, and there was a reverent hush as each person unfolded a piece of their heart. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the podium and held Harold's letter. "My husband wrote this years ago," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "He said handwriting was proof that our souls existed. I think he was right because tonight, I feel his presence in every word." The audience listened quietly as I read Harold's message aloud. When I finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Sophie came up beside me, holding my hand as the crowd applauded softly, not for performance, but for understanding. Afterward, a woman approached me with tears streaming down her cheeks. "My mother used to write me letters," she said. "I stopped reading them after she passed. But tonight, I think I'll start again." Her words were a gift, another reminder that ink, when touched by love, never truly dries. That night, back at home, Sophie and I framed Harold's letter. We hung it in the study, right above the desk where we practiced together. Beneath it, we placed one of Sophie's recent pieces, her own handwriting, spelling out the words, "Forever yours doesn't end with goodbye." I looked at her, tears in my eyes. "That's beautiful, Sophie." She smiled softly. "It's the first line of the letter I'm writing to my future family. I want them to know where all of this began." I touched her hand, feeling the warmth of her youth and the strength of our shared story. "Then Harold's wish came true," I whispered. "We've written across time." As we stood there, the candlelight flickering gently against the framed letters, I realized that love, real, unbreakable love, doesn't fade with years or distance. It's written not just on paper but on hearts. And every word, every loop, every line we ever wrote was just a way of saying one thing over and over again: I was here, I loved. And that love will always remain. It's strange how time seems to slow down when life becomes precious again. After discovering Harold's letter, I felt lighter, as if I'd been given permission to rest. But even as peace filled my heart, my body began to whisper reminders that nothing lasts forever, not even strong hands that once guided hundreds of children through their first words. It started with a faint dizziness one morning while preparing tea. The cup slipped from my fingers and shattered against the floor. The sound startled Sophie, who rushed in from the living room. "Grandma! Are you all right?" I nodded quickly, though my knees trembled. "I'm fine, dear. Just clumsy this morning." But she wasn't convinced. She helped me to a chair, her brow furrowed with worry. "You look pale. I'm calling the doctor." Within an hour, I was sitting in an examination room, the sterile smell of antiseptic surrounding me. The doctor was kind but serious. He explained that I'd been overexerting myself, that my blood pressure was higher than it should be, and that I needed rest. Rest. Such a simple word, yet I had never truly learned it. My life had been built around motion writing, teaching, creating. To stop felt unnatural, but Sophie's concerned eyes made it impossible to argue. That evening, she stayed with me, refusing to let me lift a finger. She cooked dinner, her version of soup, which was really just noodles and too much salt, and sat beside me at the table as I ate. "Grandma," she said softly, "you've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time to let someone take care of you." I smiled faintly. "You sound like Harold." She tilted her head. "He used to say that to you. All the time," I replied. "He said I was always writing for others but never for myself." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about his words and about my hands. They had written thousands of pages, taught hundreds of lessons, shaped countless lives. Now they trembled when I tried to hold a pen too long. But when I looked at Sophie, I saw steady hands ready to continue the work. Over the next few weeks, I slowed down, but Sophie sped up. She ran Inkbond with an energy that astounded me. She brought on new artists, expanded our outreach, and even collaborated with schools to teach children cursive writing again. Every time she showed me their progress reports, I felt pride swell inside me. One afternoon, she burst through the front door, holding a sleek folder. "Grandma, you have to see this." I looked up from my armchair, amused. "What's got you so excited, dear?" She sat beside me, flipping open the folder to reveal photographs, walls covered in framed letters, classroom projects, and smiling faces of students proudly holding certificates with their handwriting samples. "It's from our first school partnership," she said. "We taught 200 students how to write in cursive this semester. Some of them had never even held a fountain pen before." I traced the images with my fingertips, tears threatening to fall. "They look so proud." "They are," she said, her voice softening. "And every time I show them your handwriting as an example, they ask if they can meet you." I laughed. "Oh dear, I'd only slow them down." She shook her head. "You'd inspire them." That evening, Sophie helped me to my study. "You don't have to write tonight," she said gently, but I shook my head. "I want to." I told her. "I need to." Sitting at my desk, I picked up my pen. The same one Harold had given me decades ago, and began to write a letter addressed simply to my future family. My handwriting wasn't as steady as it used to be. Some lines wavered, the ink thick in places. But I wrote slowly, deliberately, savoring every stroke. To whoever reads this, maybe my great-grandchild, maybe a stranger who learns from Sophie someday, know that every word you write is a seed. Plant it with love, patience, and truth. What grows from it will last longer than any machine, longer than any age. This ink is my voice, and now it belongs to you. When I finished, I sealed the letter and placed it inside a wooden box alongside Harold's. 2 lives, 2 voices, written in time. Days passed peacefully after that. Sophie visited daily, often working from my kitchen table so she could keep an eye on me. Sometimes I'd watch her typing away, the keys clicking rapidly, and I'd smile at the balanced technology and tradition side by side. One rainy afternoon, she looked up from her screen and said, "Grandma, I want to record your handwriting the way you hold the pen, the way your hand moves. I think people should see it. Not just your writing, but you." I hesitated. "Oh, Sophie, I'm hardly camera ready these days." She laughed. "You're perfect. You're the reason this all exists." So she filmed me, sitting at my desk, the soft light of the lamp falling across my face. I wrote my favorite quote, "Ink speaks where hearts remember." When I finished, Sophie zoomed in on the last word, the flourish of the R fading into silence. "I'm going to use that for our next campaign," she said, her eyes shining. "It's our message. Your message." I nodded, my heart full. That night, I dreamt of Harold. He was standing in our garden, smiling, his hands in his pockets as lavender swayed in the breeze. "You've done it, Eve," he said softly. "You've written a life worth remembering." When I woke, tears slipped quietly down my cheeks. The house was still, the air heavy with the scent of rain. I could hear Sophie in the next room, humming as she worked. I called out to her, and she appeared in the doorway. Concern etched on her face. "Grandma, what is it?" I smiled weakly. "Nothing, sweetheart. I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" "For being my second chance at teaching." Her eyes filled with tears. She came closer, kneeling beside my chair, taking my hand in both of hers. "You were never done teaching, Grandma. You just needed a new student." We sat like that for a long time, my frail hand resting in her strong one, the weight of generations held between us. As the clock ticked softly in the background, I realized that legacy isn't something we leave behind. It's something we pass forward. One stroke, one story, one heartbeat at a time. Later, as Sophie packed up her things to head home, she turned to me in the doorway. "Get some rest, Grandma. Tomorrow, we start planning the national workshops." I chuckled. "National, is it? My, how you dream." She grinned. "You taught me that dreams are just unwritten letters waiting for courage." After she left, I sat by my window, watching the rain blur the world into watercolor shades. My hands ached, but my heart was light. I picked up my pen once more, whispering softly to myself, "Every stroke tells a story, and mine isn't over yet." The morning began like any other, quiet and slow. The sky outside was the soft gray of early dawn, the kind of color that makes the world feel wrapped in cotton. I woke to the smell of coffee brewing Sophie's doing. No doubt. She had come over the night before to stay with me, insisting she didn't trust me alone after my dizzy spell last week. When I walked into the kitchen, she was already there, humming to herself as she poured coffee into 2 mugs. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said with a grin, using the same teasing tone I'd once used on her when she was a child. "Good morning, dear," I said, smiling. "You're up early." She shrugged. "Habit. I've been thinking about our new workshops, how we could combine storytelling with calligraphy. Maybe people could write their own letters to loved ones during the sessions." I sat at the table, watching her move about the kitchen. "That's a beautiful idea. You always find new ways to give handwriting meaning." She smiled softly, but there was something in her eyes, a glimmer I couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness, exactly, but something close to it. After breakfast, she told me she needed to run a few errands before heading to the office. I hugged her goodbye at the door, holding on a little longer than usual. She laughed, kissing my cheek. "Don't worry, Grandma. I'll be back later tonight." When she left, the house fell back into its familiar stillness. I spent the morning in my study, rereading old letters. There was something comforting about the rustle of paper and the faint scent of ink that lingered even after all these years. Around noon, I noticed a small cream-colored envelope on my desk that hadn't been there before. My name was written across it in Sophie's now elegant handwriting, the loops smooth and graceful, a far cry from the sharp, impatient strokes she once made. My heart caught in my throat. She must have left it before she went out. I hesitated for a moment, fingers trembling slightly as I slid my nail under the seal. The envelope opened with a soft tear, and inside was a single folded sheet of parchment. I unfolded it and began to read. My dearest Grandma, by the time you read this, I'll probably be at the office or running around trying to keep up with work, but I wanted to leave this for you while the house was still quiet. There are some things I need to say, things I've said before, but never quite like this. You changed my life. And not in the cliché, storybook way people talk about. You changed the way I see the world. You made me realize that beauty isn't in perfection, it's in effort, in time, in love that takes its shape through patience. When I laughed at your handwriting, I didn't understand what I was mocking. I wasn't just dismissing ink and paper, I was dismissing history, soul, connection. I was dismissing you. And I'll carry that regret forever, even though you've forgiven me 100 times over. But I've also learned something else, that forgiveness isn't just about letting go. You didn't just forgive me, Grandma. You gave me a new beginning. You taught me that legacy isn't about fame or recognition, it's about love that keeps teaching long after the hands that wrote it are still. Sometimes I look at you and think, this woman doesn't realize she started a revolution with a pen. Because of you, people are writing again. They're slowing down. They're remembering. Every time someone sends us their handwritten story, I think of you. Every time someone smiles at their own imperfect loops and lines, I think of your steady patience beside me at the table, guiding my hand. You've written yourself into 1,000 hearts, Grandma, mine most of all. When you gave me your pen, you gave me more than an heirloom. You gave me courage. You taught me that art isn't meant to impress, it's meant to connect. And you showed me that even the smallest act, like writing someone's name beautifully, can remind them that they matter. One day, I'll have children of my own, and I'll teach them what you taught me, not just how to write, but how to care, how to slow down, how to see the beauty in what others overlook. And when they ask me where I learned it, I'll tell them about you, about the woman whose handwriting once made the world pause long enough to remember what love looks like on paper. I know you'll tell me not to say this, but I need to. You're my hero. Not because of the calligraphy or the business or the lessons, but because you never gave up on me. You never let my arrogance harden your heart. You wrote love into me, even when I didn't deserve it. I'm still learning, every day, how to live up to that gift. I love you endlessly, Sophie. By the time I reached the end, my vision had blurred completely. Tears rolled down my cheeks and splattered softly onto the parchment, smudging the final word, Sophie. I traced the loops of her name with trembling fingers, marveling at the grace in each stroke. How strange, I thought, that the same handwriting that once mocked mine now carried the gentlest words I'd ever read. It was almost poetic, the circle completing itself through ink and love. I sat there for a long time, rereading her letter until I could almost hear her voice in the room. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I reached for my camera. I wanted to capture the letter, to preserve it just as it was, with its tiny tear marks and ink smudges. After taking a photo, I placed the letter inside my journal, right next to Harold's. Husband and granddaughter, two voices decades apart, both telling me the same thing. You mattered. You left something that stays. That evening, when Sophie returned, I met her at the door before she could even set her purse down. Without a word, I pulled her into my arms. She laughed softly, surprised. What's this for? For everything, I whispered. For the letter. For understanding. She hugged me tighter. I meant every word. I know, I said. I could feel it between the lines. We sat on the couch afterward, the fire crackling softly. I told her how I'd placed her letter next to Harold's. How it felt like the three of us were finally together in one place. She smiled through misty eyes. Then that's where it belongs. The room grew quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that feels full, the sound of love settling comfortably in the spaces between us. I realized then that the greatest gift life had ever given me wasn't my career, or my art, or even recognition. It was this, the chance to see my love reflected back to me through another's handwriting. As Sophie leaned against me, I whispered softly, "You've written yourself into my heart, just as surely as I wrote myself into yours." She smiled, closing her eyes. Then neither of us will ever fade. And in that moment, as the firelight danced across the room, I knew she was right. Some stories don't end, they just keep writing themselves in new hands, new hearts, new generations, one letter at a time. I never thought my handwriting would travel farther than the four walls of my classroom, or that something so personal, so ordinary could one day touch strangers I would never meet. Yet here I was, an old woman sitting in her armchair, watching the world rediscover the beauty of pen and paper because of a story that began with a laugh. It was Sophie's idea, of course. She came rushing into my house one morning, her cheeks flushed with excitement, her phone clutched in her hand like a precious secret. "Grandma!" she exclaimed. "You need to get dressed. I'm taking you somewhere special." I raised an eyebrow. "At my age, dear, I prefer a little warning before adventures." She laughed, pulling me gently to my feet. "You'll want to see this one, trust me." We drove for nearly an hour, out of town and toward the city. I tried to pry the details out of her, but she refused to explain, only smiling in that mischievous way she had since childhood. When we finally stopped, she led me to a large intersection bustling with people and traffic. And then, when I looked up, I understood. There, towering above the busy street, was a billboard, not for a product, not for a company, but for Inkbond. The words shimmered in gold script across a white background, every curve and loop unmistakably mine. "Ink speaks, where hearts remember." Below the line, in smaller print, was my name. Evelyn Carter. The hand behind the words. My breath caught in my throat. I stood perfectly still, staring up at it as the world moved around me. My handwriting, the same loops Sophie once called chicken scratch, now stretched 10 feet high, glinting in the sunlight. "Oh, Sophie," I whispered. She stood beside me, her eyes shining. "It's part of our national campaign," she said softly. "We're launching it across major cities, billboards, posters, bus stops, even digital ads. It's about reminding people that handwriting still matters, that it connects us." I turned to her, my eyes wet. "And you used mine?" "Yours was the only choice," she said simply. "It started with you. It has to end with you, or maybe continue with you." I laughed through my tears. "You've made me immortal, my dear." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You made yourself immortal the first time you picked up a pen." We stood there for a long while, watching as people stopped to take photos, some even smiling up at the message as if it spoke directly to them. It was surreal to see strangers connect with something that had been born quietly in my little cottage, written in solitude, shared first only with my granddaughter. That evening, Sophie showed me the rest of the campaign. There were videos and interviews, short clips where she told our story. In one of them, she spoke directly to the camera. "When I was younger, I laughed at my grandmother's handwriting. I thought it was outdated. But when I grew older, I realized her handwriting wasn't just beautiful, it was proof of patience, history, and love." This campaign is a tribute to her and to everyone who still believes in the power of words written by hand. Hearing her voice say those words felt like the closing of a circle that had begun so long ago. The response was overwhelming. The campaign went viral within days. People began posting photos of handwritten letters, journal entries, and even recipes, all tagged with the phrase, "Number Ink Speaks." It became a movement, families writing to one another again, children learning cursive, couples exchanging love notes instead of texts. Sophie showed me messages from strangers. "Your grandmother inspired me to write to my mom again. I found my late father's letters last night. For the first time in years, I felt like he was talking to me. Thank you for reminding us that not everything needs a keyboard to matter." I read every one of them, tears streaming freely. I had never imagined that something as simple as a pen could make such a difference. One morning, a letter arrived from a school teacher in another state. Her class had participated in the Inkbond Challenge, where students wrote handwritten letters to their grandparents. Enclosed were copies of several letters the children had written. One little girl's words struck me most. "Dear Grandma, I wrote this so you could see my heart instead of my phone." I pressed the paper to my chest and whispered, "That's it, Harold. That's what we were trying to say all along. As weeks passed, the campaign grew into something even larger, a cultural phenomenon. Sophie was invited to speak at conferences, and every time she mentioned me, she'd smile proudly and say, "None of this would exist without my grandmother's handwriting." Sometimes she'd take me along, letting me sit in the front row. I'd watch her on stage, eloquent and passionate, and feel tears sting my eyes. She had become everything I hoped she'd be: creative, compassionate, wise. But one particular event, held at the City Museum, stood apart from the rest. It was an exhibition called Letters That Lived. Inside, hundreds of handwritten pieces were displayed under glass love. Letters, journals, postcards, classroom notes, even grocery lists from decades past. Each one told a story. At the center of the exhibition was a single display, a framed collection of 3 letters: Harold's to me, mine to Sophie, and Sophie's to me. Beneath them was a small plaque that read, "3 generations, written in ink, a family's love preserved beyond time." When I saw it, I couldn't hold back my tears. Sophie came up beside me, slipping her arm through mine. "Do you like it?" she whispered. "It's perfect," I said softly. "He's here with us. I can feel him." We stood there, surrounded by the soft murmurs of visitors and the faint scent of paper and ink. People lingered in front of our display longer than any other, some quietly wiping their eyes. And I thought maybe this is what legacy truly means. Not fame, not wealth, but leaving behind a trace of your love that others can still feel. That night, back home, Sophie tucked me into bed like I used to do for her when she was small. "Grandma," she said gently, "do you realize what you've done?" I smiled faintly. "I didn't do it alone." She kissed my forehead. "Maybe not. But it started with your handwriting, and the world finally saw what I see." As she turned off the lamp and closed the door, I looked toward the framed letters hanging on my wall. The glow from the hallway light cast a soft halo around them. I whispered, barely audible, "We wrote our story well, didn't we?" The wind rustled outside, carrying the faint scent of lavender through the open window. Harold's garden still blooming, still alive. I closed my eyes and let my hand rest over my heart, imagining the weight of a pen between my fingers once more. "Ink speaks where hearts remember," I whispered again, my voice trembling but sure. "And my heart remembers everything." And in that moment, I knew even when my hand could no longer write, my words would keep living, in Sophie's letters, in her students, in strangers halfway across the world who had learned to write again because an old woman refused to stop believing in the power of a pen. The applause had ended long ago. But the silence that followed was filled with love. Because love written in ink never fades.